You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 390 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I got a lot to cover on today's show. I actually missed the Monday and Wednesday episodes this week. I was doing some traveling. Got back, the neighbors were working on their apartment, and my allergies were really bad, so it didn't really work out to make a show. But I'm feeling a little bit better. Things are quieter next door. So I'm going to try to get out one episode today, one episode this weekend to make up for at least one that I missed during the week. But there is a lot of important news to talk about. Yemen, a U.S. drone was shot down. Afghanistan, 2 soldiers were killed. The Iranian supertanker, the Grace 1, was finally released by the UK territory. I need everybody to take the time to share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute on the homepage. It's in the right-hand column along with my daily news roundup, which has also been a little spotty overall this summer, but especially in the past week. Although my summer's kind of wrapping up now, and so I would expect that I get back on course with 5 daily news roundups a week. Again, top right-hand corner at the Libertarian Institute. Last note before I start the show, the monthly live stream for my patrons will be next Wednesday, the 28th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you're a $5 a month donor to the show, I'll post a link in the Patreon group about an hour before, so you'll be able to join the chat and talk to me on a episode of the show that I'll run. Ask anything you want, talk about anything you want, especially if it's foreign policy related. In the past, the great Steve Waskow and Will Porter have joined me, so it's usually a fun time. If anybody wants to ask questions, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus or at the private Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. All right, let's get into the news. First up on today's show, I'm talking about Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. During the campaign, Pompeo was a part of the Never Trump crowd, said that Mr. Trump was unqualified to be president. Well, Trump gets elected president, and Pompeo, as consistent with his career, makes moves to get himself in line with the party leadership in the direction that the party's going. I believe he had the favor of Vice President Pence, and that's kind of how he gets put in motion to becoming Secretary of State. If you read the story here, you'll kind of understand how maybe there was some real struggles within the Trump transition team between the period of time Trump being elected president and actually taking the role as far as appointing people to different positions. And so you have quotes from people involved in the transition team saying they're not even sure if Pompeo filled out like the questionnaire or anything like that, but he ends up being nominated and confirmed as CIA director. If you go back and listen to the early episodes of the show, I'm actually talking about that nomination process and raising red flags about Pompeo, especially on his Iran policy, which to me is the most concerning because it seems to be like in this Christian fundamentalist philosophy that he possesses, that somehow Iran is like an existential Muslim enemy. And so that was always a consistent position of his. He's also brutal against whistleblowers, I think advocating for the death of Edward Snowden. Now, after Tillerson gets removed as Secretary of State, the CIA director, which, man, there's some crazy Orwellian stuff going on that you have somebody moving from top spy over to top diplomat. I mean, I'm guessing for people in the rest of the world, this was a massive red flag. Imagine like for the Iranians, you think, well, in 1953, the U.S. CIA overthrew our country's government. And so now you put the top diplomat as a former member of that organization. That's absolutely crazy, but that's kind of what happened there. And I guess this whole Mike Pompeo's a yes man who's able to conform his policy really made sense when you look at some of the things he has said, because as CIA director, he did put out a report saying that Kim Jong-un isn't an irrational man, and that came out prior to the Trump administration really softening their stance on North Korea. And you also have him going along with just about every other Trump policy. Like I said, the position on Iran, I think, is a fundamental belief of both men. Both have long-term been anti-Iran for wrong reasons that don't make sense, but, that's what they believe. But he's gone along with the Trump policy on Yemen. He's, helped Trump mask and maintain the close relationship with Saudi Arabia despite the war crimes and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He's very pro-Israel. Again, has helped the president to mask wars in Libya and Somalia. A couple, I think, of his more famous, statements as Secretary of State involve him releasing the 12 demands to the Iranians, many of which, as I've discussed on this show, are things that Iran simply isn't doing in the first place, so the demands are absolutely unmeetable by the Iranians, and it's just an excuse for the U.S. to wage this economic warfare against Iran. I guess if you're looking at it as, is it a good or a bad thing that the Secretary of State, other than being a former CIA head, is just a yes man, I guess could be a little bit dangerous when you think about Trump's policies being somewhat all over the place. If Pompeo just jumps on board with everything, then he's going to jump on bad with bad ideas. I think Venezuela would be an example of that, where I guess at least the Secretary of State still isn't Hillary Clinton, which says a lot because now it's a current CIA man. But, she pushed Obama into that humanitarian disaster in Libya. She started that war because she wanted to take out Muammar Gaddafi for her own personal political reasons. And, as a resulted in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of, Libyans dying so far, the complete destruction of that state and ongoing civil war there. And, just to exemplify that disaster, another 100 people, we're 8 years later now, another 100 people just this week drowned off the coast of Libya trying to make it into Europe to escape that hellhole. Other news in the State Department, Stephen Beijing, who I've talked about on this show quite a bit, he is the man leading peace talks now with North Korea. Although as far as I could tell, those talks really aren't going anywhere right now. Although I do believe that the war games between the U.S. and South Korea that simulated the occupation of North Korea ended this week. And so maybe now we're going to have an opening to start some working level talks with the North Koreans. But Beijing, I guess is how you pronounce his name, had an opportunity to become ambassador to Russia. So I guess it shows that this guy is in good favor with the president, but he turned that down in order to try to get a peace deal done with North Korea. A little bit of a gamble on his part, I suppose. It seems like, ambassador to Russia would have been promotion. I'm not sure that this guy is actually dedicated to peace or is any kind of peacenik like the rest of us. So I'm not, even if he becomes Russia ambassador, it doesn't mean that he's going to lead the U.S. to renewing the New START treaty, which I guess would have been the hope to him taking this job. But at the same time, I don't know if there's enough will in the United States to make a deal with North Korea to actually get a deal there done either. And who knows what kind of hawk is going to be appointed as ambassador to Russia now. But it seems like this Steve Beijing guy could have been the best bet there. The State Department announced they approved an $8 billion weapons sale to Taiwan. The sale is for F-16s and then spare engines for F-16s. This will surely upset China. I've talked a lot on the show recently about the rocky relationship between the U.S. and China for several reasons. The Taiwan issue and sailing U.S. warships through the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and America asserting that China does not have territorial claims to the water that China claims to. To a lesser extent, the situation in North Korea, and now the way things are going with Hong Kong and the trade war. There's just so many different prongs of the hostilities and the confrontation between the U.S. and China right now that adding these $8 billion in F-16 sales are only going to complicate what's going on everywhere else. I haven't talked on the show a whole lot about the protests in Hong Kong. I think in part is they're a little bit less significant than everybody makes them out to be. There's been some decent reporting here and there, and I'm never quite sure exactly what to believe. I think the truth is somewhere between that, this is a popular uprising and this is a U.S. color-coded revolution. I don't think it's necessarily either of those. I think the U.S. does have some influence here. It's certainly met with a lot of the Hong Kong protests, especially the student protest leadership. And I think now, especially that the extradition law has been dropped, the student protesters are the ones more or less leading, what's going on here. There's definitely some police oppression and police brutality. And I never like to see civilians being shot at or, gassed by anybody in uniform. But there are definitely provocative and intentionally provocative and at times violent actions undertaken by the protesters as well. So it's not, kind of very a simple situation to just say what's going on here. It seems like some of the funding that's going to the protesters is through organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy and this Epoch Times. I've read this news source before, but Moon of Alabama does an excellent job breaking down what that is. So I'm going to link to that article in the show notes page and explaining how this is U.S. at least supported, anti-mainland China propaganda and how this has helped to fuel the protest movement. Moon of Alabama also has another good article about how Western media is inflating the number of protesters in these, Chinese protests. There is a real science to being able to determine how many people are in a certain area. And to be honest, I think a lot of times the media overcounts it. And so it's really easy to see a street full of people and think, wow, they said that's 1 million people and I can't count them all. So it's 1 million people. But oftentimes that number that's given as 1 million is actually in the low hundred of thousands. Another big story in the past week has been Israel denying Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib, U.S. Congresswomen. They're part of the Squad, and I really hate that stupid name, but that's what they are. And they were denied a visit to Israel because of their support for boycott, divestment, and sanction. As I've explained on the past on the show, I myself am not like any kind of signed on member to BDS, and I certainly have different kinds of problems with, that movement. However, certainly shouldn't bar anyone from visiting Israel because of BDS. And this has largely been the response even of the pro-Israel American Center. And so people like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, AIPAC, J Street have all come out and condemned Israel's decision not to let Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib in the country. Tlaib herself is actually a Palestinian. And so I guess part of her tour to Israel and Palestine would have been to visit some family there, including her grandmother. This is kind of a weird twist in the story where I guess after she was denied a visit on, a more political tour that she was planning on taking with Ilhan Omar. So when she was denied that tour, apparently she filed a request to go on a limited visit just to see her grandmother. And that was approved by Israel, but then she denied that. So I'm not quite sure exactly how that all played out and why she would have filed a request she would have later denied unless she was hoping Israel would say no to it. Or one of the, I think, problems that I have with some of these members of the Squad and just some young politicians in general, I think this is a shortcoming, is there some kind of too reactionary, and rather than either realizing that if you're going to file the application to go see your grandmother, maybe you should do that. Or if you're not willing to accept the terms that, she applied for in the application, then not to apply in the first place. It was just a really strange move that I think took a little bit of air out of her general, positive move here. They were able to generate a lot of condemnation for Netanyahu and Donald Trump with, their planned tour of Israel. I guess one thing I should talk about here is these tours of Israel that are put on, and most of the, for a long time, they've been designed and carried out by pro-Israeli groups, oftentimes in America, 501c3s, and they take, 60, 70, however many congressmen over to Israel, and they show them around, and they show them a very sanitized version of the country that makes it look like there's not oppression of Palestinians, and that the Israeli Defense Forces act in measured and only necessary opposition and in protection of the, citizens of Israel against the Palestinians. When in reality, it's actually an oppression of the Palestinians. And many people who go and visit Israel and kind of just see the sights, they go to Jerusalem, then they go to East Jerusalem, and they see the comparison of how the Palestinians are second-class citizens there versus the Israelis who are, have all the full rights and a lot of privileges of being citizens of Israel. And then you go maybe to the West Bank and look at some of the territories there and realize that, hey, there's Jewish only roads, settler only roads over there. In Gaza, it's an open air prison if they go and see that, or, assuming that they're even able to. And so when people look all of that, I think then they start to see the reality there. And that's what Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib's tour would be. And I'm sure the whole time, like, one advantage of the younger politician classes, are constantly on Twitter recording themselves, walking around and, showing what's actually happening and how Palestinians are treated as second and third class citizens there. One good example of this, of the Palestinians being treated as second and third class citizens, is how they're able to travel. And there's a good article in Mondo Weiss today that kind of chronicles a couple Palestinians trying to travel and, all the bribes they have to carry out and everything else they have to do to make that possible. And the simple thing is that it's very difficult for any Palestinian to go anywhere, even if it's just within greater Israel. For a Gazan to leave Gaza, it's almost impossible, even if you're critically injured and need, some kind of treatment outside of Gaza. Sometimes you're denied permission by the Israeli state. If you're a Palestinian that lives in the West Bank, you're not able to fly out of an Israeli airport. You actually have to cross into Jordan. And they say this one guy went and tried to, fly out Jordan, and they told him that, you violated something. You can't come try to cross into Jordan for another 5 years. Apparently, trying to travel outside of Israel labels you as suspect by the authorities there, and often gets you, some pretty serious questioning by the Israeli authorities. And I think, this is probably one of the real hallmarks of, an apartheid state, that they don't let the people travel outside of the country. In the past, I talked about Ahed Tamimi, who was, first of all, arrested for slapping an Israeli soldier who shot her brother in the head, but was later, denied permission by Israel to go abroad and speak of, her role as a young Palestinian activist. Although I guess she did get some permission to travel outside of the country to be a student in the UK, although I didn't see really any activism from her during those few months that she was outside of Palestine. I believe she resides in the West Bank. Overall, I think the biggest note here for me was that, the center, the pro-Israel establishment rejected this move to not let Omar and Tlaib into Israel. So I guess that's somewhat good and important. It's always interesting to see, when somebody who is a representative kind of gets mad when the general rights of representatives are stepped on. So, Nancy Pelosi, I can't believe they would let congresswomen into their country. Well, first of all, I guess I can understand why a lot of countries wouldn't want U.S. government representatives there, just because it's one of the most violent organizations in the entire planet, the U.S. Congress. And there's definitely a reason why people would be upset with and oppose them. But at the same time, the U.S. funds Israel to the tune of $3 billion or so a year. And so these congresswomen should absolutely go and check out the situation. Moving on to Afghanistan, where on Wednesday, 2 U.S. soldiers died. Just more unnecessary death. That's really the only lesson that could be drawn from this. We could see this with the fact that the Taliban control more territory in Afghanistan than any time since 2001, and that the U.S. is in deep negotiations with the Taliban. We're able to make a deal should we want to leave that country. The Taliban will agree to try to keep ISIS and al-Qaeda down there, I'm sure to the best of their abilities. And finally, have U.S. citizens stop dying over there. All soldiers don't need to die over there. And our bombs certainly don't need to be killing people over there at this point. But yet, that's the process that continues. If you look at 2019, it's a deadly year for civilians in Afghanistan. And increasingly, it's not the Taliban, but the Afghan government and the U.S. government that are responsible for all those deaths. Trump met with Pompeo, Pence, Bolton, and Zalmay Khalilzad, the leader of the U.S. talks with the Taliban this past weekend. I haven't heard any big breaking news from that conference. All the reporting around it really has me pessimistic about the talks. They're talking about only a drawdown from about 15,000 to 6,000 to 7,000, I suppose. So not actually all that much lower in numbers than Trump came in with in the first place. Looks like it's going to be a drawn out deal, and nothing is official yet. Although Khalilzad did return to Afghanistan, or I guess Qatar, to speak with Taliban representatives. But like I said, the recent reporting has me a little bit more pessimistic than I was in the past, where these round of talks were able to go on, and it seemed like progress was being made and both sides had positive things to say. In the past, at least, the Taliban really haven't put up with too much wishy-washy or American whatbats. They're pretty quick to say, okay, well, if that's your position, if you're changing your mind, then we're done with talks. Our demands are consistent that all foreign forces need to leave Afghanistan. There's an important article at The Intercept. I believe Alex Edmonton is the author, and he explains that there's one crucial aspect that nobody has really talked about yet, and it needs to come up, and that's the support of the CIA for Afghan militias who act, I think, often outside the control of the Afghan government even. The Knost police force, I believe, is one of these groups. And they're oftentimes very guilty of committing very violent crimes. I talked about them in the past. They'll kill civilians and make it look like the civilians are doing something dangerous. They blow up houses of innocent people and do all other kinds of very brutal tactics attempting to suppress the local population, which they're unable to do. And so it should be important that if the U.S. withdraws, the CIA also withdraws their support for these kinds of groups. Big news that captured headlines out of Afghanistan was that over 60 people, I think the last count I saw, 66 people, died in an ISIS suicide bombing on an Afghan wedding. This story was definitely given a lot more time in U.S. media than other suicide bombings and big attacks and civilian deaths have been in Afghanistan over the past couple of years. I guess it doesn't surprise me that the way the media frames this is Trump is talking about getting out of Afghanistan, but look at all the violence going on there. Not look at all the violence going on in Afghanistan. Trump better be getting the hell out of that country. Another thing that really bothers me is that in all the reporting on it, they never really ask or explain to the audience maybe how ISIS came to Afghanistan or if ISIS and the Taliban are allied, because I think most Americans with, their limited interest in understanding of Afghanistan think that the Taliban are allies of the jihadists, which is absolutely not the case. And in fact, in Afghanistan, the jihadists have been the enemies of the Taliban. And, the ISIS-K, this group that maybe is a little bit less jihadist than any al-Qaeda guys running around the country, have also been, the enemies of the Taliban. And at times, the U.S. has carried out missions against ISIS-K, and then the Taliban has as well. I don't know if there's any coordination between the two. My guess would be no. But, mutually beneficial, it worked out that they're beating up on the same group there. How ISIS-K came to Afghanistan would be a very important question, because this is a result of Barack Obama's drone war in Pakistan combined with his support for the Afghan government against the Pakistani Taliban. And when they got pushed over the border in Afghanistan, they became ISIS-K. The brother of the Taliban leader was killed in a suicide bombing in Pakistan. And the last thing I want to mention here is just, there's going to be mass protests in Kashmir on Friday, I guess. But one of the general effects this is having on the region, I guess, is pulling more Pakistani troops away from the Afghan border and towards the Pakistan border with India and preparing to combat India rather than maintaining border security. And so this can make it easier for Taliban or whoever else, ISIS-K, I suppose, and maybe any jihadists that are running around Afghanistan, Pakistan, not necessarily allied with anyone other than, their global jihad mission, to cross easier between these two countries to, avoid being picked up or detected. So that seems like, a little bit dangerous and possibly could interfere with U.S. and Taliban peace talks. Trump has said many times that getting Pakistan in line and enforcing that border is going to be important to him and to restoring the U.S. relationship with Pakistan and getting a deal done in Afghanistan. The Iranian ship, the Grace 1, that's been reflagged as an Iranian ship and has name changed, but that's the supertanker that entered the Mediterranean Sea and was seized by the UK territory, Gibraltar, and held for a couple months now. In response, Iran seized a UK ship, and so, this is just increased the hostilities in the Gulf. Well, finally, the Iranian ship has been released. This was over the protest the United States has actually released a warrant for the ship. The Iranians have not yet released the UK ship. Maybe they're waiting for this Iranian ship to reach its destination before they release the UK ship. And from my understanding, the destination of this Iranian ship may be Greece, although some people are speculating that it'll likely start to offload a lot of its oil while it's in international waters and take that to wherever the ship had planned to go in the first place. I definitely think there's political significance to the UK territory releasing the ship, also that being done over the protest of the United States. Some news in Syria. The Syrian government is working and taking more territory in the Idlib province. They've now surrounded the town of Khan Sheikhoun, and most of the rebels have withdrawn, although there's some jihadist factions still remaining in that territory. This will be a pretty significant territory pickup for the Syrian government in their campaign to take back at least the rest of the territory on the west side of the Euphrates River in Syria from the jihadists there. One interesting story here is that apparently Turkey was planning on sending some supplies to the rebels there and were turned back by an airstrike that was carried out by Russia. Turkey said none of their forces died in that strike, and so it must have been like, they bomb ahead of the convoy to let the convoy know they need to turn the hell around or else the next one's coming for them. Turkey said 3 civilians died in that attack, but there is no confirmation of that. The last thing I'll say is the U.S. media is either not as interested or has finally given up on the Syrian opposition because from what I've seen so far, the reporting as far as, what it's been like in, let's say, Aleppo or around Damascus, whenever the Assad government was taking territory, this is a slaughter of civilians, look how many innocent civilians Assad is killing, he's using gas, he's using all these other banned weapons, what a terrible, terrible thing. There's really none of that reporting going on in Idlib. Maybe that's because everybody knows now that territory, like most of the other territory in Syria held by the rebels, is held by al-Qaeda linked factions. So a U.S. drone was shot down over Yemen, and the biggest thing that has absolutely baffled me about this is nobody asks, how can the U.S. be flying a drone over Sana'a, Yemen? This is territory held by the Houthi. The U.S. is not at war with the Houthi, although Obama and Trump have supported the Saudi-led war against the Houthi, but they've been very careful to say that, our support is only providing maintenance, intelligence, mid-air refueling, selling them bombs, not actually deploying American troops and forces to the region, which would seem to be the case if we're flying drones over the country. The story the media picked up on was, this may be an Iranian-made missile, so that proves that Iran is backing the Houthis, and, this is Iran malign influence in the region, all that other warmongering hysteria. But, the real question I want to know the answer to, and that everybody in America should be answering to, is why the hell was the U.S. drone there in the first place? And thank God we were just using an unmanned drone. That way no Americans died. We could expose the fact that America is waging an unconstitutional war in Yemen and get the hell home. An interesting development for me in the war in Yemen was that an Houthi delegation actually visited Iran, met with the supreme leader, and the supreme leader says that the Houthis have the support of Iran. Now, it seems to me that when he said support, he means like pat you on the back, you have my support, not we're sending you home with a truck full of missiles. Although Moon of Alabama and others have, kind of given the analysis that Iran has at least shared the technology and the information on how to make more advanced drones and missiles that has allowed Houthis to really have a more advanced missile program, are now able to fire missiles deep into Saudi territory. There's a couple good articles, and I've talked about Moon of Alabama a lot, and I'll link to a lot of those articles in the show notes page already. So this time I'll link to one by Alistair Crook, and he goes through and explains how the Houthis' ability to target, now Saudi and Emirati oil infrastructure and maybe even a UAE nuclear plant makes it a very dangerous situation to continue the war against the Houthis. Overall, the war for Saudi Arabia in Yemen is going unbelievably poorly. Now, the faction that they have in Yemen, which I guess was a combination of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Al-Islah Party, the Yemeni government with some, former loyalists of Salah and whoever supports Hadi in the south, and then a collection of southern separatists who view the Houthis as an ultimate enemy, has fractured, with the southern separatists now taking over the capital city of Aden and other territory, and the Saudis carrying out airstrikes against Aden, their second capital in the country, in order to try to take that back from another group. It seems pretty clear to me the one person who has about zero influence in Yemen at this point is the Saudi and U.S.-backed president, Mansour Hadi. He doesn't have either capital city. He's lost them both and is losing more territory to the southern separatists who rather just have South Yemen be their own country because I guess they really don't like the northern men and the Houthis. The southern separatists, I guess, are not completely figuring out something to do, again, with the Saudi government, saying that if the al-Islah party is removed from the government, then they would, again, be a part of it. All right, the last thing I want to bring up on today's show is I talk about all this war overseas, but the war's at home too. And I'll link to this article in the show notes page, but basically some families in Chicago are suing the police because their children are being terrorized, being given PTSD by American police who kick down the wrong doors and point gun in children's faces. I mean, we live in a pretty sick place here in America too. If there's no recourse, there's no justice, there's no cops losing their job when they kick down the wrong door on a bad warrant, or, falsify information, or, get bad information from a CI and point a gun in a child's face. I mean, you would think that any cop involved in that would instantly lose their job. Whoever was leading the raid, definitely. I mean, you kicked down the wrong door. How the hell do you let that happen? You point a gun in a kid's face. How do you let that happen? It shouldn't happen. Shouldn't be pointing guns at children ever. Come on, you know what I mean? And this is what happens. The children end up extremely traumatized, and I'm sure, are just miserable right now and working through a whole bunch of stuff. The help is probably pretty limited for them. Community mental health isn't all that good, and people who live in poor communities, are the ones terrorized probably by police, have, probably not great political, representation. The lawyers they hire aren't as great as what the police unions are able to hire. They're high dollar lawyers who know the judges and everything and are able to get things worked out in their favor. And so there's so much disenfranchisement and, terror of these people. It's absolutely disgusting. I guess it's not quite as bad as being an Afghani child and having an American kick down your door because you don't even speak the same language as that guy, but I'm sure this is a whole lot better. All right. Like I said again, bonus show hopefully this weekend to make up for missing one this week. And then the Patreon live stream the 28th, August 28th, Wednesday, 9 p.m. Eastern time. Patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus. Support there to join. LibertarianInstitute.org to share the show. I appreciate it so much.